So why don't we just take a moment and go around and introduce ourselves so we know who's here tonight. And oh, we've got a few more joining us, just a second.
Oh, Peggy.
Yeah.
Oh, Kristen.
So I'll start. My name's Kathy Eastry. I've been a member at Christ Church for 46 years, going on 47. And we bring these classes and programs to you through our Faith to Life team at Christ Church. And we're just glad that everybody's joining us tonight.
Will be dark faces. Yeah.
So
I'm Maria Heller, and this is Rick Orvold with me. And we are happy to see all of you, but I am thrilled to see Peggy, whom I have not seen for over a year.
Yeah, me too.
yeah.
I'm Elizabeth McCauley.
Cooper Wiggin, Capricorn.
I'm Joel Charlson, and I had mentioned to Kathy that I would really like to hear a presentation like this, but I had no idea who could ever give it. So all of a sudden, I am so pleased.
Okay.
I'm Jenny. Oh, sorry.
Peggy?
Okay. Peggy Milbrandt, and I'm just happy to be here.
We're glad to see you too, Peggy.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Hi, I'm Dick, and I'm with her.
I can't hear.
You can take attendance, right?
Can you hear it?
No.
Hello, my name is Kristen, and I was the Eli intern at CUMC last year. I see Elizabeth and Cooper on the line. Hello, and Jenny, and my grandpa as well. Hi, John.
Hi, Kristen. Yes, it's John rather than Chris than Janice.
We have someone else joining us too. There's Tom.
We should use mine.
Hank and Rose, do you want to introduce yourselves? Whoops, they left us. Or no, they're here. Okay, I'm going to get started. And what I would, is there someone else that didn't introduce themselves? Linda, is it Lindsay?
I'm Lindsay Young. Yep, I'm a frequent attender at Christ United Methodist Church.
Well, it's good to have you join us tonight. Thank you so much.
Pardon me.
Okay. Jenny introduced herself. John, everybody. How about Hank and Rose? Have you introduced yourselves? You're muted.
Well, you're still muted.
You're still muted. There you go.
Okay. He unmuted me, but it went back to mute. Yeah, we're having trouble with the sound. I'm not sure what's happening, but I put his earphones on so I could hear, but he can't now.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what's happening, but
Okay. Well, hope you.
we're using his computer instead of mine. Mine's better.
It's good seeing your faces.
Yes.
Thanks.
Tom, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm still finishing supper, so I'm going off
okay.
camera.
Okay, good to have you join us tonight. So tonight we're going to be talking about giving in a time of crisis. I'd just like to, our presenters tonight are Leah Holm, and it's Elizabeth's daughter, which she's very proud of. And they're going to be neighbors soon too. So, Leah is from Duluth. She grew up in
Can I
Duluth.
take this stuff?
And she's also been organizing money and people for 16 years. And in her 10 years of full-time individual fundraising, she's often had a fundraising budget of $0. So she's learned how to solicit donations of donuts and beer and take major donors out for coffee instead of lunches, and host guerrilla style events in public places so she wouldn't have to pay for space. It's fair to assume that if you have a question about fundraising, she's been there. And Leah serves as the lead coach and trainer for Give Minnesota and lends her expertise to create their overall fundraising training curriculum. So thank you, Leah. And Stephanie Klein. Stephanie was born and raised in Rochester, so she's a part of our community here. And she's seen it going through many changes. She's worked in community development and fundraising for a number of local projects and organizations such as the Kutzky Park. Neighborhood revitalization. I don't know if you're familiar with that area of town, but it's very nice. Next, Chapter Ministries, which is assisting people returning to their communities after incarceration. And she's volunteered for numerous school-related fundraisers while taking off from professional work to raise 4 kids. She's most recently worked as Director of Audience Development and Donor Relations at the Rochester Symphony. And she currently serves as board president at the Southeast Minnesota Youth Orchestra. So thank you very much. We appreciate them taking the time and presenting tonight. There are a few things. If you would mute during the presentation and use your chat if you have any questions while Leah and Stephanie are presenting, and then we will have question and answers after the presentation. Okay, so can you see the chat? Leah sent us something. Okay, so I think we'll get started.
Okay, crew, we're excited to be here. It's actually really nice. This is a perfect number of people, so we'll hopefully have some space for folks to ask questions and have some good discussion. Like Kathy said, we're going to kind of start with a piece on like where the money comes from and where the money goes and how money is currently moving in the nonprofit sector, how that's changed or not with the pandemic, and kind of setting up a case for a particular lens to use when thinking about giving. And then Stephanie, and then we'll have a little break for Q&A. And then Stephanie will talk about how just some things that like fundraisers wish donors knew, and maybe to give you a little bit of tips around how to be really strategic and smart when you are investing in organizations or donating to organizations. And then we'll have more time for Q&A. So that's going to be kind of the flow. We do have a little PowerPoint thing. It wouldn't be a presentation without one. Stephanie is going to be in charge of keeping an eye on the chat while I'm giving my section, and then we'll swap. If you have an understanding question that shouldn't wait until Q&A, like you're just like, I don't understand what that chart means, or could you say that a different way? Please feel free to put that in the chat, and then Stephanie will interrupt me. And I'll just say that like, we'll be talking to each other too, because we have no way of communicating besides over Zoom. So me and Stephanie will be chatting as we do this. We met each other actually through fundraising work together, and Stephanie is a super competent fundraiser, and that's the reason I asked if she would be willing to do this with me. And I feel like she is going to be able to offer some cool insight on the Rochester area in general for folks. So without further ado, the place I always like to start when we're talking about money and how it moves in the charitable giving sector is literally like where it comes from. And Kathy, we can skip ahead one more. I just totally blew over the agenda slide. Can y'all see that? Okay. Okay, awesome. So one of the things that a lot of folks don't know, even folks who work in the nonprofit sector, is kind of where funding for nonprofits tends to come from. A lot of times we think that 3M is going to take care of us, or that there is a massive foundation in town who's going to be able to provide 100% of what we need. But the truth is, if you look at where charitable dollars come from nationally on a yearly basis, you can kind of see, right, that only 5% comes from corporations. I'm sorry, I'm going to be like up in my screen because I'm kind of blind at this time of night. 17% comes from foundations, right? So grants that organizations can apply to. And then the rest comes from individuals, which might surprise some folks on this call. Bequests are 10% alone. And if y'all are familiar with that kind of jargony term, it basically means individuals who write organizations into their wills, which is still just individuals making gifts, right? Just in a different way. So the vast majority of money that comes into nonprofit organizations comes from individual donations. The only asterisk I would put on this is that if government funding was included in this graph, it would swallow this graph 12 times like the sun. Government funding is actually far surpasses any of these portions here, but because we tend to not take that so for granted as donors, it's not on this one. If you go to the next slide, Kathy, this kind of gives you a breakdown of where all those charitable dollars go from all of those different pots of money. Just give you a second to look at that. Since we have a littler group, does anybody want to like lift up something that surprises them about this graph or that they're noticing about it?
I'd be curious, you know, where I hang out. I would imagine that the religion piece, what I've heard is that that's shrinking as the education piece is growing because people in education know how to ask for money.
Ooh, interesting.
That's what I've heard.
Interesting scuttlebutt. It's good shaming. That's a good shaming case for pastors anyways.
No, I just think it's a good lesson.
Yeah, no, the religion portion of the pie has definitely shrunk over the last couple of years, for sure. Now, whether that's related to, I think y'all actually are better at asking than anybody else in the world because you send around an offering plate every single Sunday. Most organizations ask like once a year. By comparison, y'all are killing it. But I think what might be accounting for the decline in that portion is just the number of people who are going and participating in religion is actually dropping in the United States pretty substantially. So it could just be that like, because religious participation is dropping, y'all are also seeing a decline in funding that way. I always thought it was kind of interesting when you look at this, that like civil rights is super small, if not non-existent, right? And it's really health, human services, and education that kind of, and religion that make up the bulk of charitable giving across the board. So y'all are in a good position. You're in a competitive position when it comes to other nonprofits in the sector. So that's awesome. And again, you're really good at asking, I think, outsiders' perspective, compared to a lot of nonprofits who I have to like twist their arms to ask more than once a year. We can head to the next one if that's okay. Giving during the pandemic is super interesting, y'all. So basically, you know, one of the things that we have seen, GiveMN, I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, but it's like a giving platform. So if you go to givemn.org, you can kind of search for any organization that you want to donate to and make a donation. And we also run that annual giving day, Give to the Max Day. I don't know if y'all are familiar. It happens typically in November. Your inbox is usually a nightmare the week leading up to that. But one of the things that we have the privilege of seeing based on that position and based on running the Giving Days is kind of how giving in the state of Minnesota has changed from year to year. This year, despite the fact that organizations were asking way more than usual, and the need was much more substantial than usual, the number of individual contributions have just blown prior years out of the water. So individuals are absolutely stepping up and contributing to organizations they care about and issues that they care about. You know, there were over a typical year for Give to the Max Day, we'll have like 2,000 organizations running fundraising campaigns. This year it was over 3,000. The best year we've had on Give to the Max Day up until this year was 21 million. This year it was 32. So individual donors are stepping up in a massive way to be able to help folks weather this pandemic in a variety of ways. And that is really what has kept a lot of the nonprofits across Minnesota afloat in a really significant crisis. Let's see. That's also true across the United States more broadly. Fundraising professionals across the United States are seeing just an incredible surge in giving. And I'm sure that makes sense to each of y'all on the call, right? Each of us are kind of we know that we have to step up individually to be able to address this crisis in a lot of different ways. Sometimes that means checking in more frequently with grandparents. Sometimes that means tipping more than you typically would. Sometimes it means spending thousands of dollars at your local bookstore because now it's like your job to keep them open. I'm totally guilty of this. So, you know, folks are stepping up and we haven't seen a slackening in that over the last year, which is really heartening and beautiful to see. So in a normal year, individuals giving money is important. In a year like this, individuals giving money is super important. So I'm delighted that we had so many of you who were interested in figuring out how to do that differently or how to think about it. And that is your role. So one of the things that I was thinking about and Stephanie was thinking about as we were coming into this session was kind of I think the question that was interesting that Kathy initially posed, and it sounds like came from somebody in this room, was like, how do you know where to give strategically? Like, how can you think about being an individual donor and how to make the best impact in a moment like this with that identity and with that role? And we would like to offer a lens to use when thinking about giving broadly. We know that each of y'all support a large number of different kinds of organizations. You support your church, you probably support your kids' school or your grandkids' school. You probably have a couple of key organizations that you donate to on a regular basis. And it's not in our interest or anybody's interest to say that you should stop donating to the places that you currently give. Because if you loved organizations before this pandemic, rest assured, they still need that love as we're going through this together. But if you were interested in thinking about other ways that you could expand that impact, one of the key pieces that we wanted to offer is that there's a way in which systemic racism is just alive in the nonprofit sector and in how money moves as it is in the rest of the realms of our life in the United States. So we wanted to just kind of lay out for you how systemic racism tends to show up in how the money moves in the sector in order to explain why it's even more important, particularly for folks who identify as white, to seek out and fund organizations led by and serving Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations. So with that, let's start with like the super basics, right? We know, as you can see from this slide, there was a report in Minnesota Public Radio recently. We know that the economy particularly is crumbling for people of color in the state of Minnesota right now. Where most white folks have been okay so far. I mean, not great, but like are hanging in there. A large majority of households of Latino folks and Black folks have experienced significant financial hardship since the beginning of the pandemic, right? So the wealth of communities is dropping in this moment. That has impacts on the individual giving for organizations that those folks love, right? It's if your community is in free fall, your folks can't donate as much as they used to. So what this means is that in a lot of ways, if there were organizations that were supported by folks of color, like they have seen their funding drop significantly also, right? The revenue of like Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations has also dropped. If you head to the next slide, Kathy, this was a report that was done recently on how the pandemic has impacted funding for organizations led by and for folks of color. And you can see, again, this is very small for me, but you can see how like it has dropped revenue in earned income, individual donations, government funding, and grants has typically declined, particularly around individual donations and earned income for folks of color during this pandemic and organizations that serve folks of color. And those grants are actually going down from a place that was pretty bad to begin with. If you head to the next slide for me, Kathy, thank you. These are how the grant changes during the pandemic has shown up across 3 different racial categories, right? If you can see that. And then the next slide is like a very small percentage of grant funding was going towards those organizations to begin with, right? So what was already a systemic disinvestment, basically, in organizations led by and for folks of color, having that funding drop even more precipitously in this moment just makes their day-to-day operations even more untenable. So one of the things that we would encourage you to do when you're thinking about how to like have a bigger impact in your giving is actively seek out and invest in organizations that are led by and serving folks of color in Rochester and in Minnesota in general, as a way of like redistributing some of the wealth and investing again in communities of color. If you go to the next slide, Kathy, you can go to givemn.org. And in the search, there's a filters box on the side where you can actually select and search for organizations to donate to that are BIPOC led or BIPOC serving. And that's what that acronym means, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And that might give you a starting place if you don't currently support any organizations that are led by or serving folks of color, a place to just start and poke around, right? If you love the arts, there is likely an organization in there for you. If you love housing issues, if you care about women's health, you'll probably be able to find an organization that matches with those values that has likely just statistically seen a decline in their funding in the last year. Whew, so many graphs. Who has questions? Tell me what your questions are. Or reflections, I would also take those. Things that surprised you. What do we think?
We're quiet in the chat box too.
So you said that the overall funding is up, but the giving towards organizations led by or supporting people of color has diminished disproportionately. Is that
yes?
Kind
And
of
individual giving by individuals is absolutely up for sure. Yes, and organizations led by folks of color are not seeing that increase. Exactly. Yep.
One thing that I have heard in this time with a nonprofit that I'm very closely connected to is they've also seen the piece of the increase in giving. And the theory is just that it's something that people can do right now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a wonderful testament to people's hearts for sure. But you've given us a whole nother piece to think about, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Well, so often, y'all, we give to organizations that our friends know or that we have like a personal connection to, and our lives are just as racially siloed as they are in other arenas of our life, right? You know, the way we move through the world is defined in large part by race. So what that means is that we're often donating to organizations that a lot of our buddies are also donating to, which has this kind of like reverberating effect of not spreading the wealth around in ways that might be more just or equitable. It's a very human thing, right? I'm sure all of y'all have been invited to fundraising events or like fundraising hangs with buddies. I mean, this is just what we do. So part of what we have to think about if we really want to expand the impact of our giving is like, who are we missing, right? Like where are the pockets of folks where because of where I live or because of where I'm involved are kind of outside of my peripheral vision a little bit.
Well, and this is really challenging for a church community because, you know, Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. Right? And so how do we stretch ourselves to make sure that we're maximizing the generosity that exists in our organization, because it's wonderful. But then how do we in turn do what you're doing tonight? So now you got me going. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions, reflections? Fun. Okay. Now Stephanie and I are going to, Cooper, I see your hand.
Leah, Stephanie, welcome to both of you. I'm wondering about the popularity / notoriety of Black Lives Matters in the last year, particularly, and if that has, if one can trace a change in supporting them, positively or negatively.
I love that question. All we have at this point is anecdotal evidence because a lot of the like year roundup data isn't out yet. And anecdotally, right, it appears as though things have trended up a little bit. There are particular organizations who've done extraordinarily well, who have been building relationships for 10 years, and somebody at a national level, you know, shared a local Black Lives Matter chapter organization's link, and like they just blew up and raised $25 million. But again, you know, the stories like that are pretty aberrant and rare because it takes a lot to get to that level of visibility. So while Black Lives Matter National as an organization and a couple of the more well-known advocacy organizations may have seen a significant increase, often that doesn't trickle down to the, you know, the dozens of local shops who are piecing together salaries, you know, month by month. And there's actually a great report about funding on this that I can send along to Kathy for her to distribute to y'all if you're curious. That kind of lays out what the unique impacts of the pandemic on that particular area of the nonprofit sector have looked like, in case y'all are more curious and you want to dig into that more.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question.
This is Hank, and I have an observation that I remember from about 34 years ago when a manager at IBM was talking to those of us who worked under him about the giving during a United Way campaign. And what he said is that when he was in, I'm trying to remember the name of the town, was it Johnstown that had a dam break? an earthen dam break and flooded the city, the town. When he was there, he said, when it came time for people to give to United Way, people really pitched in. He said, I come to Rochester and I don't see the same level of commitment. It seems to me that people who have been through difficulty are more willing to give when they have the means to give. And I wonder whether that has anything to do with this epidemic and people giving more during the epidemic. Just an observation that comes from about 33, 34 years ago.
No, Hank, I appreciate you bringing that up. I mean, there's a couple of things that you said that are worth teasing out, right? So the urgency of an immediate crisis is like absolutely a foundational factor in what motivates folks to give oftentimes, right? And one of the things that is unique about this pandemic experience is that you don't have to make a case that things are bad right now. Folks can see, even if they're not plugged into an organization, that the circumstances are really tough and that there will absolutely be a need because of that circumstance, similar to a natural disaster like you're talking about, or a non-natural disaster. So that's absolutely true. The thing that's, I think it's hard to compare that against just like general giving, right? Because that's where the art of fundraising and the craft of fundraising really comes in. And Stephanie, I'm curious if this resonates with you at all, but it's like, it's a fundraiser's job to take somebody's knee-jerk almost gift and change that into a relationship with the impact of the organization in a way that is sustainable and long-term. And so I think there's like a wrinkle too in what you've offered, where fundraisers can really help bridge that divide between your initial donation in something because there was a crisis and how to maintain and sustain that important work after the crisis has gone away, but the work is still needed. Does that make sense? Did I explain that properly, Hank?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think the people who've been through difficulty have more empathy for others, especially if they have been the recipient of some sort of generosity.
Yes, and thank you for reiterating that too, because that actually is statistically true. Folks who have a way lower income contribute far more of that income to charitable causes than super wealthy folks. We like to think that like wealthy folks giving a couple $1 million is like this enormous, like generous act, when in fact, folks who are like at the poverty line and just above contribute far more of their annual income to charitable organizations than wealthy folks. So when we think about like folks who are predisposed towards generosity, sometimes we don't think about the right people. And like exactly like you're saying, having gone through some things makes you aware of all the need that is out there, for sure. For sure. Anybody else have anything before I kick the mic over to Stephanie?
I have a question which I've been struggling how to ask it, but
those are my favorite kinds.
Large organizations, and I'll use the example of Red Cross, which I tend to think of as doing a lot of good work, but I also think of it as having maybe some overhead, some very highly paid leaders. And sometimes that's just a turnoff for me. And I, am pushed towards people more like yourselves that are doing a little closer to the people. And some of the larger organizations, I think their people maybe are closer to the big money donors. And I'm wondering about the effectiveness and, how much of my own prejudices are working against my goals.
Ooh, Oh, that's
really
such a
weird
big
question.
topic, Joel. No, it's such a big topic, right? And it's one that is all over the nonprofit sector. So this is what I hear in your question is actually like, how do we I hear the tension, which is like, how do I know my money is being used well if I can also see with my eyes that like their executive is making like over $1 million a year, right? Like how do these two things talk to each other?
Exactly.
And if we were to zoom out from that, right, I think, Stephanie, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this too. So I'm going to kick this over to you after I take a crack at it. But one of the things that Stephanie and I are in agreement on, right, is that in order to do good work, you have to have admin. You will have admin costs. No good work in the world happens unless there is somebody like helping with scheduling and processing the checks and, you know, setting up the space. It's part of the impact of the work is possible because there are people around the work making it happen. Jenny, right, exactly, Jenny. So, you know, if we zoom out from the Red Cross example, right, and just think generally about how to evaluate admin costs or fundraising costs or anything like that with the amount of money that goes directly to the work, which is how some organizations describe it, that kind of setting up that kind of argument is actually pretty problematic in nonprofits, right? Because we know that we have to have good people running an organization like the Red Cross for it to function. It's enormous, right? It has like offices, you know, like 12 offices per state. The infrastructure, it just blows my mind. I can't imagine the amount of money it takes to run all of those blood bank vans on a daily basis just blows my mind. Like they must have an entire mechanical department, right? And I don't think any of us would argue that like having a department that makes sure that those trucks don't break down in the middle of nowhere is a waste of a donor's money, right? So for me, part of it is, you know, sometimes nonprofits are held to an unfair account for the amount of money that technically goes to admin or technically goes to program, because we legitimately just can't do the work without everybody who's a part of the organization helping. Now, there are egregious examples, right? And edge cases where there are well-established nonprofits who have raised money for, and we'll use Red Cross because you said their name, right? Like said they were going to be doing stuff in Haiti. The money didn't go there. The money like went somewhere else. And that's a whole different thing. But I think generally it's pretty complicated to evaluate the impact of your gift based on something like, you know, what an executive makes or what the admin team makes. But I don't know if I said that properly. Stephanie, what do you think?
You know, I think it's one of those things that we as fundraisers, it makes us a little uncomfortable to talk about because we get into the arena of making a judgment on what organization is worth someone's donation. But there are certain things that you can do to sort of give a gut check as to whether or not this is an organization that, yes, they have some very highly paid executive kind of level function positions on staff versus, oh, it's just really not possible to see where this is going, or when I look at the annual report, it doesn't quite add up. And so I would just encourage people when they're looking at larger organizations like that, access the financial statements and the annual reports online. And I think that if you do a little bit of research, you can usually tell whether just going to use the term legitimate, you know, whether donations are being used in a legitimate way. Now, that being said, some organizations I think are more suited towards those really big corporate donations because the work is just so big. if you give a donation of $25 to someplace like the Red Cross, you are still giving your money towards something that is a worthy place, and they provide a worthy service. But there are smaller organizations that perhaps you could have a bigger impact on, and that's just a personal evaluation that you have to make. The other thing that I would say, and we've heard this come out in the newspaper for a few different local organizations, when the salaries of some of our favorite nonprofits are published. And the thing that you often hear is, well, if they weren't in nonprofit, they would be making 4 times that. They would be making 4 million instead of $1 million, or $1 million instead of 250,000. And the unfortunate truth is that, the unfortunate thing is that that is really true.
It's 100% true. Yeah.
Some of these organizations that are so complex, like the Red Cross, they're doing international work. The complexities are enormous. They do compete in that arena for leadership and financial people that, may still be taking large pay cuts to work in nonprofit, despite the fact that their salaries look completely enormous to us. And so those are just some things I think to keep in mind when you're evaluating organizations. And, beyond that, I think it's just really a personal choice and comfort level as to where you feel led to give.
Yeah.
Stephanie, I think it's really important to give to these larger organizations that have an international impact. I'm thinking of things like American Friends Service Committee, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, which I think if I have any complaint about them, it's the amount of money that they spend in advertising. There's, we get so many mailings from them, and I really like the work that they do, and we do try to evaluate them. And frankly, the one that we have supported for years that we have a hard time evaluating is American Friends Service Committee, because it's classified as a religious organization and they don't have to file the same reports. But the actual work that they do, I think, is crucial for change making across the world.
Yeah, those are some really good examples of, different ways that I think important reasons why people can be led to give to really, really large organizations. And they can certainly also be organizations where if you pool resources and do, some kind of a fund drive as a group, you can certainly have a bigger impact there too on those groups. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think that there's any reason not to give to an organization that's large like that. It's just kind of a matter of personal preference, I think.
And don't get eked out if those folks make really good money to manage that kind of complexity.
Yeah, I mean,
the talent thing is totally real, Stephanie, that you brought up. Like, it is really tough to compete for super competent folks when you're paying $25,000 a year, y'all. Like, it not only from a talent pool perspective is tough, it's even more tough when you're trying to attract candidates who aren't like white affluent folks who can afford to take that kind of a pay cut to work at a nonprofit, right? If you want a diverse staff, you actually, like, even folks who have kids, like diversity in terms of like age, right? You gotta be able to compete salary wise, and salaries come from fundraising.
Yeah, there's been, quite a few things written about whether or not we see people that run nonprofits as sort of volunteers that we pay a little bit and we expect them to actually raise very little money, or whether it's better for the nonprofit if we pay them as professionals because they're doing a professional job, and what happens within those organizations. And there's been a lot of I can't give you any facts or figures right now. There's been a lot of evidence to show that if those organizations do have the resources to professionalize a little bit, not only are they more effective at raising money, but they also are more effective at delivering their mission. As soon as somebody has the opportunity to pay a decent development staff, they're usually within the first year, their fundraising more than pays for that person. And so again, within the area of legitimacy, there's always those outliers where we find out that somebody was maybe doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, in which case they usually get caught. Within the area of legitimacy, there's a pretty good evidence to show that those higher paid people earn what they make for the organization. So.
Such a good question, Joel. We appreciate you.
Yeah. Interesting.
And with that, I will kick it over to Stephanie this is a perfect segue actually into like, let's dig a little bit at what we mean when we say admin and like what's happening behind the scenes at nonprofits that y'all may not have visibility to, but both Stephanie and I do as longtime fundraisers.
Yeah, and my analogies and stories that I'm going to give you are just a little bit, I think I tried to think about it from, Leah set us up good with a lot of really good information. I'm just going to try to give you some good basics as to how you can maybe adjust your thinking about donating in order to do something small and basic that can actually have a big impact. So just a little show of hands, how many of you consider yourself fundraisers or a fundraiser? Got one. Got one, another one. Some of you might have a camera off, that's okay. So I see not a lot. How many of you have donated to a nonprofit? Any kind of nonprofit? Everybody. How many of you convinced somebody else to donate to an organization that you are passionate about? Oh, a little more hesitancy there. We've got a few hands up. That's basically fundraising. And so if you raise your hand to that, you are already a fundraiser, and you probably just didn't even think about yourself that way. Okay, so Kathy, if you can advance to the next slide. Giving is not just about making a donation, it's about making a difference. And this sounds really basic, because that's why we give to the organizations that we care about. But I always find it a really good starting point to remember, and you can go on to the next slide, that when you combine your money with your values, that really turns into change for the community. And so I have a little story about the first time that I ever did a formal training with Leah. And I had been doing fundraising for Rochester Symphony for a year or two, and it's a lot of rejection when you're working in professional fundraising, because more often than not, you're told no when you ask people for money. And the first session, she said, money is good. You can't do any of your work without money. And it sounds so absurdly simple, but it actually, for people in nonprofits, is something that we have to be reminded of. It's a real shift in mindset, because we tend to think that actually we should try to do without money. Money is bad. We should try to ask for it as little as possible. And the reality is that the more of it that we have in nonprofits, the more work that we can do and the more change that we can make in our communities. Another little story, the first time that I was really doing community development work, I was working in the Kutzky Park neighborhood, and it was a huge, we were taking on as neighborhood leaders a huge revitalization effort. The neighborhood was not great at that time, and it was all volunteer, and it was very intense. And I remember somebody telling me about a grant that I should apply for, and I applied, and we got the grant, and it was $30,000. And for the work that we wanted to do, I remember someone saying to me, you're not going to be able to do much with $30,000. And to me, $30,000 seemed like all the money in the world at that time, because we had nothing. And I really believe that with that first grant and that first little pot of money, that it changed the trajectory of that neighborhood, because we were able to pay for a few professional services. We were able to pay a staff person to do just a little bit and to stay organized. And things really took off from there. So that's often my example that I like to tell people when I think about how great money is for nonprofits. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So giving during a crisis is often different than giving during normal times. And from the background in this, I can kind of tell you, whoop, let's see the slide that says, yes. We're missing some text on that, but it should say have realistic expectations. I think it's giving Kathy a little bit of trouble. One more up. And there we go, we got it. So it should say have realistic expectations. And one of the things that is happening, particularly during this pandemic, is that not only are many organizations, up to 40% in Minnesota, are saying that once the pandemic is over, it will be very difficult to extremely difficult to recover. So nonprofits are doing more with less. But in the same circumstance, people that run your nonprofits are working like this poor woman from home in this picture. This is her office, and she not only is trying to work in her closet, but she also is taking care of children at home. And so my point is that one of the things that we often look to nonprofits to make us feel as though our money is going to be used wisely is sort of a polished and professional appearance. And your nonprofits may just not be quite at that level right now for all of these reasons that we can all relate to. And so if a thank you note is late, if things aren't quite as polished on their website as you're used to seeing, it isn't that they're not able to deliver their mission. It's just that we're all kind of struggling through this really, really crazy time right now. You can go to the next slide. Viewing your gift as a partnership. We oftentimes as donors have a tendency to commoditize our giving. If you give to public radio, they provide broadcasting. If you give to a food pantry, they provide food to people in need. But oftentimes what we're seeing during the pandemic is there are certain organizations that are having a really difficult time providing their service simply because of the pandemic, not because they are struggling in any other way. Arts and education organizations, for instance, are really struggling with this right now. They've always provided something in person and they have got to shift majorly, and their audiences are not so ready sometimes to do all the things online that they used to do in person. And so if you view your donation as a partnership, what you're really saying is that I'm invested in this organization in a way that allows me to see past that. And one of the things that you can do, and if you can lead to the next slide, think about your giving in a long-term capacity. So what organizations do we really want to make sure are here for the long term because they're a valued part of our community? They're part of our value system. There are quite a few organizations who have lost funding from grants, for instance, because grants and foundations have shifted their funding drastically towards organizations that are providing direct services due to the pandemic, and also have come right out and said, we're going to kind of hold off on funding some of these other organizations because we want to see if you survive. And that's been quite a hit to some organizations. So just thinking about what organizations you want to see be a part of your community when this is all over, I think will really open up people's thinking about giving during the crisis. So some small things that you can do right now. We talked a little bit about thinking in terms of values and thinking about your donation as part of a partnership. Just reach out to those organizations. If you haven't heard from an organization that you donate to about, if they haven't asked you for a donation, you haven't received those mailings that you're used to, reach out to them and ask how they're doing. Ask how your donation can be most beneficial to them. And they will be very happy to talk to you about that. If you, well, there's one point I wanted to make about that. I lost my train of thought. If you are thinking about making a larger donation to an organization that you care about, be open to a one-on-one meeting with their development staff. You will really get to know that organization in a way that you probably would not have been able to just understand what their needs are if you just sent in a donation in an envelope or online. And they will be more than happy to share with you how your gift can have the most impact. The next slide, increase the certainty of your gift, convert it to a recurring donation. And you've probably heard this term, recurring donation. It just means breaking down what you've given a year into more manageable monthly payments, essentially. And what I found as a fundraiser, and I don't know, I'd be really interested to hear what your experience is as a donor, some of you, but I found that people did not pay much attention to this option at all. They were reluctant to use it. And in general, I think people feel a little bit more control over the gift over their gifts if they just give when they feel ready to give. But one thing that I know Leah has greatly had a great influence on my thinking on and caused me to not be ashamed of as a fundraiser is that in the nonprofit world, people are staff at those organizations are kind of expected to live with a degree of uncertainty that in our personal lives or in the for-profit world, nobody would ever put up with. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to figure out what your budget is going to be month to month, much less meet budget. And when you're kind of just relying on whether or not somebody will remember to give their gift every December like they usually do. So this is a very simple and easy thing that you can do. And it really makes a huge difference. The other thing that it becomes very easy to do when you start giving on a recurring basis, becomes very easy to add $5 a month. And by the time you give all year long, that's actually added up quite a bit for the organization. And if more people did that, the impact of $5 a month would be huge for some of these nonprofits. So if you haven't thought about that, check with your nonprofits that you're giving to and see if that's a possibility. It makes a really big difference. And then the last one, giving online when possible, and a little note about the fees that go along with that. This is very popular. You've probably all done it. But I also know that a lot of people feel like when they can, it would be better off to drop a donation off in person or send a check. And I just want to mention some of the benefits for an organization when people decide to give online. So there is no free way for an organization to process money, whether they receive a check, whether they receive it online, even whether they receive cash. Somebody has to keep track of it. Someone has to put it in the books, and then somebody has to decide how to spend it. And so there's always expense around processing money with an organization. And when you give online, even if there is a fee associated with that, either for you as the donor or for the organization, it is well worth that fee. So for example, a PayPal fee is about 2.5%. And if you give a $500 donation, that's less than $12 in fees, that provides a level of streamlining for most of the ways that people have their books set up that more than pays for how that donation, for that $12, it more than pays for their ease on their end of processing that donation. I think I'm saying that clearly. It's so efficient, so easy, so streamlined that $12 on 500 is actually pretty good value for the nonprofit. Now, if on top of that, you give a little extra and pay that fee, that frees up a huge amount of money. If everybody did that, that frees up a huge amount of money for the nonprofit. So I'll give you a little example. I'm currently the president of the SEMIO, the Southeast Minnesota Youth Orchestra. And last year, we decided as a board to go ahead and officially pass the online donation fees on to our donors. And we were kind of nervous about that. We know people don't like online fees. I'm familiar with that from the symphony too. They hated online fees for ticketing, things like that. And so we were a little nervous. But what we found is that generally people were happy to do it, to pay the fee. And it immediately freed up over $1,000 in our nonprofit budget to use on services. And that's just in an organization whose budget is under $200,000 a year. It's just a little small organization. So you can imagine if it was an organization that collected $500,000 in donations alone, that would add up to over $11,000 if donors paid online and then paid the fees. You could have a tremendous impact on that organization. So that's kind of recurring donations and giving online are two super simple things that you can do that have a huge impact on organizations. And if you can kind of evangelize that and tell your friends too, it could have a really huge impact. Okay, next slide. And then I just want to circle back to what Leah said about having an impact on our community by giving to Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations. If you want to have an impact on an underserved area of giving, you know, I forgot who it was that made the comment that an organization they're familiar with was actually not having trouble with donations. There are organizations that are providing really essential services that are, and many of them are from people or from nonprofits serving BIPOC populations. So if you are able to make an extra donation this year, or if you're feeling like you want to make an extra donation to have an impact in a true area of need, please use the GiveMN website and filter these. The other thing you can do is just Google some of the organizations that you know do good work in Rochester, Minnesota, and just look at their mission, see who they're serving or see who their leadership is. And you can have a really big impact that way too. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for the talking, but I'm happy to converse about any other questions that people have. Thank you. Oh, I did want to make there was a follow-up. The person that was talking about mailings and receiving a lot of mailings. Yeah, hi. The ability to, when you give on a reoccurring basis, if more people did that, it might reduce the amount of expensive fundraising that organizations have to do. I'm pretty sure that most organizations, especially big ones that have kind of access to data and spreadsheets and stuff like that, probably send those expensive mailings because it offers a pretty good ratio on return. But it is an expensive endeavor. And yet most nonprofits find that they need to do it because even the donors who really are committed to them have to consistently be reminded to give. And so a lot of times when they're sending out those mailings, they'll be able to filter out the people who they know have committed to give every month. And that just reduces some of those expensive marketing expenses that they need to spend to raise money. So.
Stephanie, can I take the slides off?
Yes, I'm done with those. Yeah, and I can see each other better too.
Okay, crew, what questions do you have? Questions, comments for Stephanie, reflections? What surprised you? What didn't surprise you?
So I'm interested in how you both feel about these websites that you can go to, and I'm not remembering the names of them right now, that rank nonprofits in terms of how well they spend their money. Is that a worthwhile thing to do? And I'll leave it at that.
Ooh.
We're both looking at each other to see who's going to talk on that first.
You go first, and then I'll fill in after you.
Okay.
Juicy question, Dick.
Yeah. I would say that it can, and I think that Leah, in her actual capacity of training fundraisers, might have more data at her fingertips about how valuable those are. My experience as a development person in a fundraiser or in a nonprofit working in fundraising is that they could be helpful and they could also be misleading. There are certain times when, because of the organization's mission or because of a certain history, like maybe they've made a big strategic shift, things like that, they can be misleading, and they are not always the red flag for an organization that you might think. And so I guess my advice on that would be, if there's an organization that you would like to donate to, or if you're looking for an organization that provides a service that you want to support, by all means use it as a starting point, but don't use it as a final decision. I would go to then that organization's website, see what you can see. And then depending on the size of your donation, do not hesitate to reach out to that organization and ask the questions that you have in your mind. If there is something that looks a little, I want to know about this. What did you do? What happened in 2018 that maybe caused a dip here or there? I mean, you know, those are questions that their development staff or executive director or whoever is in charge of fundraising at the organization would, I'm sure, love to have a conversation with you about. But yeah, I would definitely not use it as an end all be all of a judgment of an organization.
Yeah, y'all, one of the things that fundraisers know that donors wouldn't know about that process is that the application is a friggin' nightmare. So like the way that and this is I'm gonna ask y'all not to repeat what I have said outside of this room, because I work for a nonprofit that like plays nicely with other nonprofits, like organizations like you're saying, Dick, but having been in a nonprofit who was like super legitimate, national, we had, you know, incredible financial procedures and everything else. It was a struggle to even get a silver in one of those because the paperwork is so bananas to just, and when you're thinking about the way that those kind of sorting, or I think they call themselves like credentialing organizations, make their calls is by running nonprofits through just a ridiculously arduous and complex paperwork process. That even for a well-funded organization, I was working for a $4 million organization that struggled to like do everything they wanted you to do in order to get that certification. It's for organizations who have one executive director and one program person, that kind of paperwork is just not, it's just not possible to fill it out in a way that would make them, that would accurately reflect what they're actually able to get done on the ground. So in my experience, the process itself is a hindrance. and it preferences those organizations that have dozens of staff members who can spend literally a month filling out the kind of paperwork it takes to get some of those things credentialed. So that's what I think we could offer from the inside. I like the way you put that, Stephanie, of it being misleading, because I think it is. It's like, it's hard to gauge based on what you see, whether it's telling you information that's correct.
Sure, thank you. And I assume that the smaller organizations you've been talking about aren't even represented there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough to turn around a grant application, and that is for money. You know what I mean? Like, the incentive for a 2-person nonprofit to spend a month doing paperwork for a credentialing organization like GuideStar is just not there. It was like, it just isn't a priority, and it shouldn't be, right? They're like trying to save people's lives. So it's a mixed bag for sure.
Good question.
Ray, could you talk a little bit about the thing you offered in the chat?
Sure. Let me get myself turned on here. I've been a member of the board of directors for the Diversity Council here in Rochester for 6 years now. And we are an organization that's committed to helping people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, find civic equity, educational equity, and health equity here in Southeast Minnesota, and actually in many places across the nation. For example, we led something of a restorative justice activity in one of the communities here in Minnesota that had a person of color who was shot, and did some other things like that. But really, we're about helping people connect to resources and information so that people of color don't compete, they cooperate in finding and having services that meet their needs. How's that?
That's great. So you offered up to be a resource for folks, anybody who wanted to learn more about an organization serving Black, Indigenous, or folks of color in the Rochester area. So not only do you have a filter for some impersonal, like, sleuthing, you have a human in Ray who can connect you to some great work. So what an incredible resource. That's awesome. Thank you, Ray.
Sure.
Other questions or reflections that y'all were curious about?
I guess I just have a comment. So I'm the bookkeeper for Christ United Methodist Church. Hi, everybody. If you're interested, there's a lot of church people here. So if you're interested in what they were talking about with the fees for reoccurring giving, please do it. They're right. It makes my job really like a lot easier, and it makes your finances easier to track. It's so easy to edit online, and I'm happy to help with any of that. So if you want any insight on that type of thing, you want to know the back end breakdown down and dirty, I'm so happy to talk about it at length.
Yeah, operations people could have a whole session just on how wonderful it is to interface with online giving. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
So in defense of us older people who don't do recurring giving because we have required minimum distributions and QCDs can reduce our taxes.
Yes.
I haven't actually looked into the possibility of doing a recurring gift with our QCDs. Maybe I should, but that's the reason we haven't in our case in the past.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. There are different, it's definitely for that phase in life where you're budgeting monthly and not yearly, and when, people, I think it works really well too for people who are a little bit tighter budgets, because then they can just disperse it out. The biggest reason why I am so like try to convince people about it, is because the majority of the time when we find people aren't doing it, it's actually because they just haven't thought of it, or because they somehow, there's a mentality that they feel like they aren't as in control of their finances if they're setting up reoccurring giving. And so that's more the barrier that we want to break down. But there's definitely, you know, quite a few times when it doesn't work for people for a variety of reasons, and yours is the perfect example.
I would
Thank
give
you.
perhaps another example is, it's wonderful to give if people out there have appreciated assets. They can make donations of stocks that are appreciated and would have a capital gains tax on it. The charity doesn't pay the tax, you get the full value of the gift. And so it's a wonderful win-win against the IRS.
Yes.
I remember hearing, and I believe this was at Church of the Resurrection, they talked about giving early in the year instead of saying wait until December. And I liked that idea. They talked about it, that they actually, to encourage people, they paid their apportionments in January. And they said that, you know, this is a good example for people doing this idea of saying, I'm not going to, you know, I'm going to wait until December and see if I like everything the pastor did or how things are going. We'll wait and see how my year went. If I'm going to be, you know, if I'm going to maybe need that money. I kind of like that idea. I thought it was a good way of looking at it and saying, you know, I'm going to pay this forward. And that works for some of us who are retired and, you know, and have the assets that we're spending, not, you know, not making it as we go.
And I think that's a really important thing that nonprofits and fundraisers need to keep in mind too, that there are a variety of reasons and ways that people need to give. And we as fundraisers need to make sure that we know what those are and make sure that we know our donors and offer a variety of different ways for people to give, for sure. And that's part of that partnership mentality. You know, not only do you need to know the nonprofit that you're giving to and kind of know what their ebbs and flows are and what they might be going through at any given time, especially during a crisis, but that on the other end is the part of the relationship from the nonprofit, is to know the needs of their donors.
No nonprofit is going to be mad if you give in March instead of December, almost assuredly. I mean, like most charitable giving in the United States happens in December, which is fantastic. We love it. Donors love it. Everybody loves it. It's Christmas, like wonderful. But again, it's like, you know, if you're waiting your whole year to see if somebody is going to make that donation in December and your budget ends December 30th and like they just forgot because they went to Arizona for the winter and like went without their check. These things happen, y'all, right? Like, because people's lives are complicated. So it's like, it is like doing a job for a full year and only getting paid in December if your boss like remembers, you know what I mean? And that's just, we would not be okay with that in a job, right? So the more that we, you know, the more consistency you can offer the nonprofits you care about, and the more willing and flexible you are to shift your timelines to accommodate what will best impact the work, the better everybody will be, for sure.
The other interesting thing about giving early on in the year is that depending on the organization that you give to, they may have a different fiscal year. So arts organizations, for instance, start their fiscal year on July 1st. And I actually, after all the years of working in them, I don't know why that is, but it's pretty consistent across the board. And so if you either want to find out if your organization could benefit from giving at a different time of year, Or if you have the flexibility to give at the beginning of their fiscal year and that works out best for them, that might be an interesting question, is to find out actually when is your fiscal year and when can I give my gift to make the most impact in your budget.
Yeah, and sometimes folks just know that there are particular months that are really, really bad for their organizations on a regular basis. Like I've worked with clients for whom it's like every May is a struggle for whatever reason, because of their grants calendar, because of the way their funding works, because of the events calendar or whatever. You know, it's hard to make payroll in May every single time. And so if a donor were to say, when's the most strategic time of year for me to make my gift to your organization? I mean, individual donors being able to help them bridge that problematic month every time would be incredible. Y'all, we've got about like 6 minutes-ish. Any final questions?
Why do you like raising money? Both of you. Leah and Stephanie. Why do you like it?
I didn't like it at all for the majority of the time that I've been doing fundraising. So early on in my work, it was a necessary evil because I was always running projects that I had to apply for grants or things like that. And it was just terrible and not the focus of my work at all. But I had to do it in order to get the work done. And I honestly did not start thinking of really loving fundraising until I started working with GiveMN. And they have a program called Giving Institute?
Campaign Institute, yeah.
Campaign Institute.
Yeah.
And that I like just learned that giving is fun. And one of the things that we really discovered is, when did you realize that getting people to give money to nonprofits can just change the world? And as I started to think about all of those times early on in my Kutzky Park work, early on in health insurance work for kids, working in ministry for people coming back into the communities, it really just clicked. And I just realized fundraisers build that bridge between the values of the community and the change that happens in the community. And ever since then, I've just been kind of hooked on it. Big shift in mindset.
Which makes me so happy because I'm always recruiting fundraisers and Stephanie is super competent. So I want her to stay in the field forever.
Yeah.
I realized it the first time when I took a job. It was 2009. There were no jobs. I was determined to work at one particular organization in Colorado. And the only job that came open the whole time that I was working for them basically for free to try to get my way in there was a fundraising job. And I was like, oh, I don't know, I can like learn how to do that. There are very few people who like show up in fundraising on day one and are like, wow, I can't wait to do this. But my first role, the first project I had as a fundraiser was running their annual auction and gala. And I ran it. I learned on the job for 4 months. I slept terribly. It was a nightmare, but it went extremely well. And I woke up the next day and just realized that like I had raised and organized the money to keep that organization going for a year. And like there's you know my mom, there's like no way I will ever be able to cut an organization a $500,000 check ever in my life. That is just not in the cards for me. But it is completely possible for me to organize that money. And that's possible because all of us pooling our money makes things happen that can't happen when it's just one of us doing stuff. And so that was really the moment where I was like, ooh, ooh, nice. I could do this job. And I've been doing it ever since.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Mom.
Yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah.
Y'all, thank you so much for having us. It was a total treat chatting with y'all about individual giving. Thanks for hosting us and for your really good questions and for your thoughtfulness, or even being curious about how to be more effective in a moment like this. It's wonderful. We appreciate you.
Yeah, it's definitely a different time. And it's really heartening to see that, you know, you as a congregation are thinking about this issue. So thank you for having us.
We really appreciate you taking the time to do this tonight. And I think we've had everybody's questions answered. Is that right? So thanks a lot. It's really been fun. It's great to finally meet you too.
Likewise, and look up Stephanie, keep your eye on her. She's in your community organizing money. So
yeah,
unstoppable force. If you need some good money wrangling on a project, you know who to call.
All right. Well,
Thank you, everybody. It was nice
Take
to
really
meet
good
you.
care, crew.
Thank you. Bye. Just wait
for people to leave,
Yeah.
kind of.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
Hey, congratulations.
This is just does a mother's heart some good. Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good to see all your faces.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.
Ended, I think.